Welcome back, everybody. Today's guest is David A. Rettinger, who's an applied professor and undergraduate program director in psychology at the University of Tulsa. He's the co-author of The Opposite of Cheating, and he happens to be a former colleague of mine at the University of Mary Washington. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here talking with you.
Excellent. Well, I'm also excited that not only to be able to talk to you today, but that you're going to be back at campus, back at UMW this summer, as a keynote speaker at the Reimagining the Liberal Arts in the Age of AI conference that'll be held over July 22nd, 23rd, and I believe your keynote's on the 23rd. The title is The Opposite of Cheating, Teaching for an Integrity in the Age of AI. Do you want to say a few words about that? What do you have in mind for this keynote address?
Well, what I try to do is introduce people to the book as best we can, because there's just no way to cover something that big in an hour, even an hour and a half. So just try to lay out a bunch of the things that different folks at different levels of experience with AI and in the classroom can make sense of. Because when we wrote the book, and I think it's really even truer when we talk about it, is that there's almost everyone we talk to knows some of what's in the book or some of what's in the talk. But very few folks have really thought about academic integrity from a teaching and learning perspective, or teaching and learning from an academic integrity perspective. And so it's really useful for us. We sort of see ourselves as conveners of both people and ideas. And so that's what we try to do. I'm not going to create any brilliant new insights about AI. I know a bit about it, but I'm nobody's expert. I'm not going to, teaching and learning. I'm mostly going to describe the greatest hits from cognitive science and the learning sciences. And academic integrity, yeah, maybe I do have something new to add there. But it's the synthesis where I think people have been really excited about the book. And hopefully the talk as well.
Yeah, we've been excited about the book on campus. It was something that the Teaching Center distributed this last year, and a lot of people read it, really enjoyed it, appreciated the work, and in part because of the connection with UMW, but also, as we've seen, you all have had a great impact across the broader community.
It's a pleasant surprise, right? I mean, we're all academics. We've all written a lot of things that just go down a well. You feel like no one responds. If you're lucky, somebody cites it. It's been honestly the great privilege of my academic career to write something that's actually been able to help people and that able to interact with the folks who read it. It's amazing. I highly encourage people to get out of the ivory tower and write stuff that helps people. It's a huge win. And it's part of what we need to do in higher ed to communicate our value to society at large. But mostly it's just really gratifying. So thanks for telling me about it. I'm really happy to hear it.
Excellent.
One of the things that I find when I go to talk places is I'm often invited by somebody who I know pretty well or whose work I really respect. And they always say the same thing, which is nobody ever listens to me around here. And so sometimes you just need to be the outside voice to come in and say the same stuff that the insider's been saying all along. It's both annoying and completely understandable. So it's kind of funny for me to go to UMW. I'm not sure which I'm going to be yet.
What you're talking about, academics having an impact in getting outside of kind of the traditional publications is something, a number of guests, have talked about. And, I know your background, your trainings in cognitive, psychology and decision science, not necessarily like, applied ethics or, kind of honor type situations. But I think, did you see kind of the need there? I mean, there's always been a need, right? And now, kind of ChatGPT and kind of associated AIs kind of magnified the need. Did you think, when you're going through it, did you think to yourself, oh, I know a lot, I have a lot of knowledge about cognitive psychology and neuroscience that can be useful? Maybe when we think about redesigning instruction or just, the questions of kind of ethics and instruction and honor codes?
You'd really think that, wouldn't you? But no, it took me a long time to twig to the fact that my academic work in cognitive science had a bearing on the craft and profession of teaching. It's embarrassing how long it took. But it sort of creeps in over time. So the first realization I had, and this is probably early in my days at Mary Washington, was the fact that students don't remember anything you teach in class anyway. right? A month, 2 months later, that's not how memory works. They might remember the big picture gist. They might remember a key moment that made them feel smarter, that they built a knowledge. But all of that material that you think, I got to cover it, it's all gone. Not totally gone, but mostly gone from the ability to get it back. And so once I figured that out, then that changes everything. It brings you to a totally different philosophy of depth first, experiential, meaning-based learning, as opposed to covering the chapters. And once that hit, then, I sort of worked with that for a while. And then I started to think about all of the other things that we know about cognitive science of learning, distributed practice, generation effects, testing effects, all the stuff that everybody knows about now, but that I had known for all these years and didn't really think about in relationship to teaching. And very smart people, Regan Gurung, Vijay Sathi, all sorts of really smart cognitive scientists started writing about this. Roddy Roediger, everyone knows, I think. And so it took me a while to figure out that cognitive science really has a core place in the teaching and learning work. The academic integrity work, that's a whole other thing. I fell into that. That comes from my decision science side. And I tell this story a bunch because I think it's great. My first job was at Middlebury College in Vermont. And I got there, and I had come from a large graduate program like most people. And I was the best teacher among the grad students there, but that's not a real contest. Everyone was doing their best to do as little work as possible. And so I won the teaching award, and I thought I knew what I was doing. I get to Middlebury. I'm no joke, the absolute worst teacher in our department by a long way. And that moment of realization helped me realize how much work I had to do to actually, that this is a job. It's not just showing up and being moderately funny and caring. It's not enough. But I was chatting with the professor, the guy whose office was across the hall from mine, Gus Jordan is his name. He's a counseling psychologist who was studying cheating before I was. And we just got to talking about teaching and life and all of these things. And he's telling me about the work he's doing. And I'm thinking to myself, studying cheating with surveys is great and all, but as a behavioral scientist, I don't necessarily trust people's answers to questions about ethics. They don't know. People don't have insight into their minds. And I said this to him, and he said, yeah, I know, but it's academic integrity. What are you going to do? And I said, well, actually, there's an entire field of decision science that focuses on eliciting behaviors from people in artificial situations. That's what we do. And we said we could have a cottage industry of just replicating cheating results from surveys using these little experimental studies. And we actually started doing that. And our first couple of papers are right around the turn of the last century. And so that really got me started in thinking about cognitive science methods as applied to cheating problems. And only when I came to Mary Washington does it all come together, and I started working with the honor system, teaching cognition, and thinking about how all of these things fit together. Like I said, it took me an embarrassingly long time to make these connections, but because I've had this weird kind of path through this, it gives me some insights that you couldn't get if you started studying academic integrity. I mean, that's Tricia. Tricia started studying academic integrity, and she went the other way. She went from very narrow to very broad. And so now she's just got this incredible skill set, ranging from running testing centers to leading teams, all sorts of stuff, teaching, you name it. And we've both come to this through just circuitous routes, because that's really the only way at this point.
Yeah, there are a couple of points that you made there that I think are interesting to tease out. One of them being, as most faculty members, we aren't really given a lot of training in teaching, and we don't really get a lot of foundation. We kind of assume we haphazardly make our way through, and we stumble through it, and we kind of figure it out and piece it together as we go. What's interesting to me is the parallel between that and then the way most students start to interact with an honor code or with academic integrity, because they're not really taught that early on either, and they're kind of stumbling through it, and maybe not. Maybe this is something for you to push back on. But what I'm interested in is the way that schools like Mary Washington, where you directed the Center for Honor, Leadership, and Service for quite a number of years before you went to Tulsa, and that I think has probably informed a lot of what you did with the writing of the book. But what I'm curious about is that relational framework and the way that at a school like Mary Washington, where it's an honor council, it's run by students, it is really more in ownership by the students than it is even by the faculty. You know, we were talking recently, I was talking with a colleague about what just happened recently at Princeton, which I would love to pull into this, the idea that the Princeton honor code has been changed a bit in terms of its application so that they can start proctoring or plan to start proctoring exams again. I remember when I first came to Mary Washington, I was proctoring exams. So he said, "No, you don't do that here. That's not what we expect. We expect students to act with honor. They're going to police one another." That seems to be rolling back a little bit. And so I guess I'm interested in a couple of different directions, wherever you want to take it. Part of it is the way that the honor code at a school like Mary Washington, where it's an honor council run by students, and the way they take ownership over it, how that maybe changes the way we develop that sense of academic integrity. And then whatever thoughts you have about where you think that's going with examples of Princeton or where other schools are thinking about going back to maybe more traditional roles for academic integrity, monitoring, assessing, closely watching, detecting, and what do you think we can do about that?
Huge question. Let me start bigger and get smaller. With the widget factory model of higher education does not support academic integrity. And it's even worse now that we're doing it remotely and in the context of AI. If you have 250 students in person, online, it doesn't matter. I don't think you can assure the integrity of your assessments. It's just that simple. There's too many possible ways to evade detection and to spoof learning using AI, especially when they're not in the room with you. So I'll put a little pin in this if you want to come back to it later. I don't think online async assessment is an option going forward. I think that is gradually going to have to go away. And I tell this to people at companies like Proctorio. So I don't think anyone is surprised by me saying this. So we're going to have to think of something different. But the thing is, I love online education. Online assessment doesn't. So we're going to have to come up with something new. So if the widget factory doesn't work, it's because of the many-to-one nature of it. What makes Mary Washington and other small schools special is that we know our students. Right? That's what education ultimately has to be about. You know, as our students can get almost anything they need on YouTube, they can get almost any answer they need from AI if they know how to ask, including tutoring, right? Including problems. All of these things that faculty have been providing over the first 1,000 years of higher ed. They don't need that anymore. What do they need? What can we provide? What we provide is knowing them, having these relationships with them such that we can read their writing and say, yeah, that's better than it was. You're really using transitions in ways that you weren't doing at the beginning of the semester. Or I know you're really interested in nursing, so let's talk about how you can write this paper in such a way to include what you're interested in. You can't do that. That doesn't scale. People always ask me, how does what you're suggesting scale? And I often say it doesn't. Scale is the enemy at this point in a lot of cases. If we want the most straightforward conceptual way to gain integrity is to have relationships with people. Look at the fundamental values at ICAI, the International Center for Academic Integrity. They're all relational: trust, responsibility, honesty, respect. These are relational things. And that's the way that we do this. So when I started working with the Honor Council at Mary Washington, there was no meaningful training. The students got an hour in a room that was unscripted, unplanned, and who knows? So yes, it was very much like what I got when I started teaching. And so the first thing we did is we created an online tutorial, which is honestly only marginally better than what they had before because nobody takes those things seriously. It's just hard to care, especially when there are no consequences. So I don't blame students for that. So then we went to more, okay, we're going to have your peer mentors or your orientation leaders do skits and have conversations. Definitely better. The problem is they didn't really know what they were talking about either. So we then started training them with the Honor Council. Then we started having the Honor Council go in. So it's all about moving it to being, like you said, more about connections and relationships. And so to the extent that we can do that, I think that's the direction forward. One last thing about honor codes, which is this. They don't work in the sense that we thought they did. Honor codes do not help academic integrity. They reinforce existing cultures of integrity. If you have one, and I think Mary Washington, at least when I was there, does, then an honor code works. It makes sense. You can even sometimes leave the room when proctoring, although honestly, I don't think it's a great choice. But if you don't have that, if that culture of integrity, no honor code is going to get it for you. And the thing is, if you don't, the phrase I used to use at Mary Wash all the time is they require care and feeding. And if you don't take care of your honor system, it will stop being an honor system. It'll just be boilerplate. And then what happens is it creates the breeding ground for more cheating because the opportunities start to get easier and easier. And I think that's what Princeton students were responding to is, the culture that undergirded that honor system had eroded such that it just wasn't worth it to them to keep it anymore. And I've seen that happen at other schools too. I mean, I'm sad to say it happened at Middlebury, and they got rid of their honor code a few years back as well.
Sometimes I think, when I talk to people about AI or some of the changes they might need to make in different aspects of teaching and learning, they almost, they're not happy, right? Like they're not happy to hear the messenger. I kind of have to start with, don't shoot the messenger, right? I'm kind of more describing what I think is real, what I think is true, and, what I think are the steps you need to take. The latter part is more debatable than the former. And I hear part of your message that when you're talking to people and just even now, you're kind of saying things that maybe they don't want to hear, like the honor code isn't going to work, or, we can't really kind of guarantee, these types of assessments that are occurring online in terms of kind of what they're measuring. Another thing you said is that cheating is normal and natural student behavior, which I'm sure shocks people. And I think you're talking, within the current frame, but could you walk us through like some of the psychological literature behind that? Maybe kind of just go into a little more depth, unpack. I think some of what you were just talking about and why that just kind of becomes so normal within that frame.
Sure. I'll do it without science first, and then we can get into some data. When I give the talk, and you'll hear this in a month or so, you're going to ask people how many people drove to campus and how many of them drove over the speed limit or rolled through a stop sign. And everyone's hand will go up except for the people who rode their bike. And I say, great, you broke the rules. What's the sanction? And they'll say, well, people speed, it's natural, everyone does it. It's not really against the rules. I say, yep, that's how your students see your rules. Right? So big surprise, they're going to break them. If they don't understand the root of the rules, then they do what we call neutralization, or sometimes it's called moral disengagement in psychological literature. They're able to either intentionally or automatically dissociate a decision from the moral implications that decision has. And the easier that is, the more cheating you're going to get. And so what causes these attitudes? Well, adversarial relationships with faculty is a good example. So it doesn't have to be literally adversarial. If they feel like you're not doing a good job and that the only way they can learn is by breaking your rules, they're going to break their rules. If they feel like other people are doing it and you're not doing anything about it, then they're going to feel like they're being taken advantage of if they don't participate. So these neutralizing attitudes or moral disengagement are a huge part of this as far as I can tell. Jason Stevens has written a number of great papers. He's the one who coined the term, it's evitable, meaning that we can actually prevent it in individual situations by understanding the roots. So moral disengagement, how do you make an impact on that? Explain to students where the rules come from. Explain to them why it's in their best interest to do things the way we ask them to do them. Will this prevent cheating? No, of course not, but it'll reduce it. And some students, the ones who are persuadable, will cheat less. Then you've got motivation, right? So students who really want to learn are much less likely to cheat than students who, while they're happy to learn, really are there to get a degree for the utility that it provides. And so if that's the case, then learning's great and all, but they're not going to allow their learning to stand in the way of them getting the degree they need to do the thing they want, or to please their parents, or to get out of there before their debts get bigger. And actually, that kind of isn't an unreasonable thing to want, especially in a society that keeps telling us that nobody knows anything, that you can't trust experts, that that college is just about return on investment. Every time someone talks about ROI of college, I cringe. Yes, of course, it's very expensive and you should get something for that, but you can't always measure that in dollars. Right? Liberal arts educations are about helping people to become the best citizen, person, parent, and yes, doctor, that they can be. And so, yeah, you're not always going to get money for that, but you're going to have a better society if you do it well. And that's the value proposition that students need to help. We need to help them understand it. It's not a given that they have heard that before.
I want to follow up on that because you're exactly right in that the students haven't heard that value proposition before. Most parents haven't really understood or heard that value proposition before. So it gets to a question of how much should we be leading students and how much should we be following them based upon their behaviors or expectations. There's some tension there because it's kind of a sense of we understand that it's rational for them to cut corners in the way that we might speed a little bit because we can cut a few corners. It's okay. It's not really going to harm anything. If we don't really value following the rule just because it's a rule, it's more like integrity. I think you frame it as integrity as learning rather than integrity as rule following. So that sense of how do we get them to understand that value proposition when it seems like there's some tension that, well, we need to meet them where they are and address their needs. How do we reconcile the two? Because I think for a lot of faculty, they would say, I don't have time to do both. I can either teach them the way I know will be good for them and give them the model that I know will be good for them, or I can follow them to where they're going to say, this is what they need.
Yeah. So we need to meet them where they are, but you don't have to leave them there, right? That when you said it's learning, that's the whole point of learning is to get them from where they started to where you want them to go. The thing that I'll say this in the talk, what we have to do is start from first principles. And that means the learning objectives of our courses. We need to go back to what are we trying to do? We need to separate the must-haves from the nice-to-haves. So, for example, Anna and you and I have taught a lot of classes that are not writing intensive, but we really want our students to do some writing and get better to be better writers. That's, of course, one of the goals of every class, but it can't be a learning objective of every class. And if it's the case that it's not the learning objective in your class and you've decided that this is not the class for that, then you have to substitute something else. I mean, it's been done before. It works great. Like, let's make it a speaking intensive class, right? We're going to have them do presentations and learn how to do rhetoric, right? Anna, you've made a career out of doing that extremely well. But the point is we can start substituting new things for the things we had them do, because they need those skills too. And you have to recognize you can't do everything in every class. And so you have to pick the ones that are actually important. And yeah, that means in some classes, you're going to say that we're teaching bedrock fundamental skills of rhetoric, of statistics, of programming, and we're going to lock you out of AI because we really need you to learn these fundamental skills. You don't give calculators to kindergartners. They need to know how to do these things. But when you get to these advanced levels, maybe it's okay to use AI to get past the underbrush and get to the zone where the critical learning happens. And so back to your actual question, we have to, once we've rethought what the critical elements of our courses are, we now have to rethink how we both observe those success in those elements, by which I mean assessment, and then how do we get students to that place? And I think the first thing we have to do is go back to the cognitive science that we started with. The most blunt way I can put this is you can't teach anybody anything. You can create the opportunity for learning. You can make it as efficient and as pleasant as possible. But at the end of the day, learning is something that happens between your ears, or it doesn't. I can't do that for you. And so in the old days, when we were students, we came in with an understanding of how we needed to study to match the teaching style that colleges provided. That was a skill set that you developed in high school, so you could show up and go to lecture, take notes, memorize all the stuff you needed to memorize, and be successful at that Bio 152 multiple choice exam. That was what education was. And honestly, it wasn't that great. It worked because we all played together in the same sandbox, but how much Bio 152 do I remember? I mean, as much as I've used since then, right? If I haven't used it, it's gone. So we have to get to the reality of modern cognitive science or modern learning science and say, okay, we're going to have to teach in ways that people learn. We can't just teach the way people teach. Right? We had back when you and I were new on it, we had someone come in and do a workshop on learner-centered teaching. And I don't remember who it was, but that stuck with me for years and years, because it's true. As long as you're thinking about how you teach, you're not thinking about how they learn. And that gets back to your earlier point about this, none of us getting any training. Teaching's a craft. It's a science-based craft. Sometimes it's an art too. And so to throw an expert in some subtopic in there and say, well, you'll figure it out because you know a lot about chemistry. Historically, that hasn't worked, right? Yep. You're much better off getting someone who knows how to teach and teach them chemistry than the other way around. But we don't do that, and we shouldn't do that, because universities are about putting scholars in contact with emerging scholars. They're not about just teaching. And so we need to teach the scholars at least enough to make us useful in the classroom.
You touched on a lot of things in those recent comments, but I think one of the things you touched on without you using the term is what become popularly known as like cognitive offloading, right? That the students are using the AI instead of, thinking through and doing the homework. Just as I said, if you had your mom do your math homework, then you wouldn't learn how to do it, right? Whether you're doing it with an AI or somebody else, it's kind of the same situation. And I think what people struggle with a lot is, what do we want to cognitively offload versus what we don't? So, when you're young, you learn how to quickly figure out a certain percentage of a number. That's not really like a useful, like long-term skill, right? If you're doing it in quote unquote real life, you're going to actually use a calculator to make sure you're 100% correct, right? So when we think, I guess I'm saying, in terms of maybe what the learning objectives are, right? If a professor, an educator can think about, okay, well, is it okay if my students like cognitively offload this part? Because that I'm really trying to accomplish is this other thing. And this is where like I want them to do the thinking. So that, that's kind of one broad thought, maybe if you could reflect on. But also, I think about different ways of reducing cognitive offloading. Like in debate, it doesn't really matter that much how much the students use AI. Debates like still really hard. You've got to get up there and speak, and you got to defend your argument. Yep. You've got to answer questions. So there's really not much of a risk of cognitive offloading relative to the gains. But if you could just reflect a little bit on, where it might be okay to cognitively offload in terms of objectives, or what other learning kind of teaching and learning methods you suggest that maybe kind of reduce the worry about cognitive offloading.
Sure. Well, let me be really pedantic for a second, which is that cognitive offloading is a term we've been using in cognitive science for a long time, and it doesn't entirely reflect the way people are using it nowadays. Cognitive offloading is things like using a diary, right, to keep track of your schedule. Right, that's a much more pure example of the term. What we're talking about is, but it still involves your cognition in a really meaningful way. You're just including additional resources into your cognitive process. Whereas what we're describing in an AI is just simply not doing it. Right, what you're doing is something completely other than what you're being asked to do. I think genuine cognitive offloading is an extremely productive use of AI. The problem is that's not what we're actually talking about. We're actually just talking about is jettisoning tasks we don't want to do, right? Look at any ad for AI on LinkedIn. It basically says, hey, jettison the tasks you don't want to do.
Yeah.
Which is maybe in business is fine if the AI is good enough at it. But then again, we're back to doing math with a calculator. If you multiply 6 times 8 and get 379, if you have no intuition about math, you have a problem, because you're just going to type it in and move on. So we have to be able to help our students build these intuitions so they can use the tools effectively. I think that gets back to the point, which is AI can absolutely be a part of a student's learning process. And I think it gets back to learning objectives, right? You have to decide what it is students need to be able to do between their ears and what it is that they need to be able to accomplish. There's the metaphor in the book that says, you don't write a paper for me because I need the paper. It's the process by which you write it that I think is useful for you. Same way I don't bring a forklift when I go into lift weights. I don't need the weights to be up here. I need to have lifted them. And so our job is to then explain to students what the process we're searching for is, and then grade them on their delivery of the process. For the first time in human history, rhetoric is not a way to refine, is not the only way to create a reasonable argument, right? It used to be, going back to, before there was paper, people used to hone, I'm telling debaters, people used to hone their arguments through rhetoric. And, my professor in college used to say, Frank Yates used to say, writing is nature's way of telling you how unclear your ideas are. And that's why we write. We write to help refine our ideas and to make our arguments work. It's not just about technically putting transitions in, it's about understanding how these things go together.
Mm-hmm.
So using AI to do that is fine if you just need a paper. But if you're trying to teach students argumentation, they need to be able to put those things together, and just using it for brainstorming defeats the entire purpose. Right. So, but the students don't understand any of this. And so what we need to do is both explain it to them, but then also start to move to more process-oriented grading. That is where the rubber's going to meet the road. And by which I mean, you can no longer just grade a paper that a student turns in at the end of the semester and assume that that paper reflects anything about students' learning. It may or it may not, because the AIs can spoof that learning perfectly well. So what do you grade then? Well, what we have to do, what we've been doing for forever, is doing process grading, right? Give me a draft. Show me how this draft differs from that draft. Make comments, reflect on your process. Now, AI can spoof all of those things too, but it's harder. And it's much harder when you know your students. If you don't know them, it's pretty easy to spoof that with AI. But if you're sitting there in a room with them workshopping papers, and then they write something that had nothing to do with what was spoken, you kind of know what happened. But what's going to happen is that's going to be spoofable too. And so we're going to have to develop some new kinds of technology. And I don't want to get into an arms race here, but we haven't even tried to create visibility into process. So what do I mean by visibility into process? Things like writing suites that allow us to see how students revise things. And so then we're grading them on not just minutes revising, but how much better does their paper get? How many changes do they make to these kinds of revisions? I don't exactly know how we're going to do that yet, because no one's really trying it effectively yet. But I went to a talk and someone had presented, I don't want to talk too much about it because it's not patented yet. But the gist of it was, in his discipline, he created like the key cognitive traits of successful people doing this task. And then he built an entire LMS that evaluates the extent to which students do these things on the different tasks. And so he thinks he's got the key indicators of good process. I don't know how this would work in psychology or debate, but let's imagine that it could. Then we could be in a place where we're not grading them on just dumping a paper on us or just completing a test however they completed it, but we're grading them on what they did to get there, which is actually what we wanted to do in the first place. We just didn't ever need to before.
I think just quickly, a couple things come out there. One is, we need to have some experimentation, right? Like, people are almost resistant to try new things, as if the status quo, even before AI was perfect. And like you said, there are all kind of flaws in learning biology. And then that, ignoring the fact that AI has kind of exploded a bit and undermined what we're currently doing. Right. So it seems to me that it's okay to take some chances and allow experimentation, because there's really not a lot to lose. We're in the status quo, so to speak. We're already losing things. The second thing is that it is, maybe field in terms of content knowledge and the skills, right? You want people to develop. It can be specific. Like you were mentioning this professor who worked on this LMS for, something he was teaching skills in the field. Maybe that does or does not translate into rhetoric or the legal field or something, but that's okay, right? People can work within their own field who have the most knowledge about what skills the students need to go into that field and what the learning objectives are in that field. So one thing I always just try to push is some experimentation, and experimentation is okay because the status quo is really not so great.
I'm a big fan of failure. I mean, my colleagues will tell you this. I try to normalize failure for my students.
Mhm.
And if you see my teaching evaluations, they're feast or famine because I try stuff and it doesn't work. I tried specifications grading, and I love specifications grading on paper. I think it's a brilliant way to address some of the concerns about student motivation. It utterly did not work in my class. They had no idea what I was asking them. I didn't always know what I was asking them. The point system didn't work. It was confusing. A lot of students basically just checked out. It was a dumpster fire. It happens. It could have been great. And it probably could be great if I were willing to stick with it. And I'll get back to it again at some point, but it wasn't the right mousetrap for that situation. And so, yeah, it didn't work. And so I tell that story a lot when people ask me about what if it doesn't work? So what? Try something else. And it really helps students too. I think you've probably experienced this as well. They don't, they're not good at failure. They're not, we call it perfectionism, but schools nowadays really expect things to be right. And so they get very nervous when we say to them, yeah, that's a good start. And so especially in classes where I have lots of project-y stuff as opposed to just exams or something, I really try to emphasize not just talk about, but actually change the structure of the course so that failure is built in. So you can get a chance to redo things. Or you can make edits and revisions, and the later revisions count more than the earlier revisions. It doesn't matter what it is. Like you said, Stefan, it makes sense to do it in the whatever way makes sense in your discipline. But students need to know that they can try and have it not work. If you think about it, why does exam 1 count the same as exam 3? Don't we want them to progress? Shouldn't we be rewarding them for what they know at the end of our class, not what they know in February? In some ways, it's actually kind of perverse to say if you don't catch on to this quickly, you can never really maximize your performance grade-wise. Once I realized this recently, I was like, this is terrible. They do stuff in September that they can't fix by December. They're working toward a B all semester. What's more demotivating than that for a good student? So you don't want to just give away points like Oprah gives away cars or something. They have to earn it, but shouldn't you be evaluating them on what they can do at the end of your class rather than what they can do at any arbitrary point?
It seems a lot of what you're identifying and what we're identifying as problems are kind of the result of scaling. We want perfection because it's a lot easier to grade perfection. If they do it right, we can grade the paper where you say, yes, you did all the transition the way we want. It meets the rubric. Yes, you get the points. When the student has difficulty with it, an overloaded teacher has a hard time saying, well, I can take several hours now to help you work through that. It's more, no, do that on your own. You have to demonstrate to me. Where what we're really trying to get at is that instrument for assessment is just to demonstrate. It's to represent something, to represent learning. How else can we determine if that learning actually occurs? So I'm wondering if we peel this back and we kind of go into a thought experiment and say, let's not think about a school. Let's think about just an individual student. And you have a student that you're working with. Would you ever introduce points? Would you ever introduce tests? If you could just work with them one-on-one and you just keep tutoring them and you can tell that they understand a concept, you're going to say, oh, great, now we're going to move on to the next concept. I'm wondering how many of the elements of the difficulties, the challenges that we're facing would still persist. And what would academic integrity look like in that scenario where a student has never heard about points or a grade or cheating? They're still going to be, it's rational for them to still try to limit the amount of work that they're doing on something. They aren't going to want to have to just spin their wheels necessarily. But how much of that is all of that and the difficulties are an artifact of kind of the educational system, or how much of those are just natural traits?
Yeah, well, it's all both, right? Because people operate in situations. And so you can't separate the things. I have a friend who I hadn't talked to in a while and actually saw recently. He taught one of the big early MOOCs for one of the big corporate. And the early ones didn't have grades, and you basically got a participation trophy at the end. I used to say, oh yeah, you want to get rid of cheating? It's easy, just get rid of grades. People cheat on video games. How are we going to How are we going to
Yeah.
stop people from cheating? People cheat. It's what we do. So as long as there's a cookie at the end, and it really, honestly, it can be like rescuing Zelda, people are going to cheat it. And so you can't ignore that fact and expect to get anywhere. But you're also right to say almost everything that you've identified is a structural problem in the way we do our work. I don't think it's only scaling, but scaling has magnified these problems tremendously. It is also the case that our value proposition has changed in the era of basically free information. One of the things that we do for society, not necessarily for our students, is verify that they're able to do the things that they claim. And Khan Academy can never do that. So should we be testing students? Not in the sense of multiple choice tests in a big room, but there should be, I'm a behavioral scientist. I have to believe there are ways of operationalizing cognitive functions that are visible in the world. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't do what I do. It's hard, though. I have a PhD in it, and it's hard. So why do we expect somebody to just show up in a classroom and immediately be able to build these operationalizations? This is where our colleagues over in learning design are very useful partners. And I think actually there's going to be a future where there's a job that's assessment designer. And they really think hard about what does skill look like in a world where AI can do a lot of these things. And we're going to have to figure that out. And you're right, Stefan, we're often going to fall on our faces doing it. But that's okay, because nothing worth doing is easy. And I think assessment has to be a critical part of the changes we make in response to AI. But it's always the second step. And the first step is always figuring out what you need them to know. And then the third step is figuring out how to teach it.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm thinking of like a scenario where if you have a business or you're a professor in your discipline and you really want to tell, does this person really have the facility with the skills, the facts that I need them to have a facility with? You can sit and have a conversation with them. You can tell whether they're just bluffing or they really know it. It seems like you were referencing the other faculty member developing this learning management system that maybe can do this. And I did something very similar that on a very basic level with a chatbot that would have a conversation back and forth with the student to kind of tell where they were with it. Maybe, is there a way we could just personalize that through generative AI so that we can just get a sense how well do they know it without really giving them a test? And maybe that's where the assessment coordinator or designer comes in. It's that assessment's a different thing. It doesn't have to be standardized.
Yeah, assessment and teaching are two different skill sets. And so we are expected to have both, and they interlock, of course. It's not like you should have one without the other. But yeah, I think that is probably right. You also hit on something that I think you're going to like, which is I think that since we've sat around the campfire, the way we knew about whether someone knew what they were talking about is by listening to them and asking them questions. And so I think oral in-person assessment is actually still the gold standard, right? It doesn't scale, sure. Well, it does scale, but it's hard. But oral conversation with someone in 5 minutes, you know roughly whether they know what they're talking about. And in the time it would take you to grade a written paper, 15 minutes maybe, you can absolutely give an oral exam and grade it. Mm-hmm. So people say it's impossible. It's not impossible. You just don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it either, in fairness. So can we automate that? Well, yes, today. But I think I don't have to tell you how good agentic AI is getting. Pretty soon we're going to be in a place where your chatbot is grading their chatbot and, there's no humans in the loop at all. So I think that ultimately we need to lean into the human as solutions for these things, not in an arms race, because that we're going to lose.
Yeah, there's a couple things, makes me think about it. There's almost like a little bit of tension, right, between scaling and kind of, like you say, kind of, getting to know the student, right? Collaborating with the student, seeing what they actually can write, seeing the improvements first, how they could fake it with an LLM. We had a writing professor on. She said, look, yeah, they can write a lot with an LLM, but I really know because all my classes are small. They're 24 or fewer students. Mm-hmm. It's hard in a university we were trying to scale. And of course, scaling reduces costs, right? If every class in a university could only have 24 fewer students, the tuition would obviously have to be a lot higher, and we have competing objectives. But yeah, I think people think more about these assessments, oral assessments. I just saw some math professor, commented because I guess AI solved this math problem that people have been trying to solve for 80 years, right? And he was talking about how AI can just basically do all the math now, and we're going to have to change, how we assess faculty members instead of on publications, because AI can just do all these proofs and it can publish all the articles. But also, you were saying we probably need more orality in grading, and a lot of people were saying this. So I think that's one thing. And then I couldn't remember the name. I was trying to Google it quickly, but the founder of Mathematica, he's a pretty famous person in AI, said I heard a podcast where he was working on systems where he said, we won't really even need assessments anymore. We won't need in terms of tests. He said the system will just know what the student understands at that time, right? And then it'll move them on kind of to the next concept in math. Math's easy, right? Because it's just kind of a progression, right? So there's all kind of things out there that may just really change how we assess people. And it's already breaking, right? Like companies want a portfolio. They don't, okay, grades are a factor in your hiring, but they're just one of many things. There's an interview and, all these different types of things. But I think it's also harder to open the door with faculty sometimes because they kind of really just see that grade as the signifier, right? And that's what they want. That's what they want to protect, regardless of kind of all this other stuff that's out there. That's going to impact how well their students do.
And that's fair. I don't think you have to get rid of grades. I mean, the ungrading folks have a really good point, but I'm not a fan. I really think it's perfectly reasonable to give students grades. But again, we have to go back to what are we really assessing anyway, if we want those grades to mean what they used to mean. And I don't think, they don't really anymore. They're kind of AI spoofing a lot of the work that we've been doing. One thing that I do think is true is that people say sometimes, well, if an AI can do it, you shouldn't be asking your students to do it. And I think that's very wrong-headed.
Yeah.
I think that gets back to calculators and kindergartners. There are some things humans need to be able to do because you can't do the more complicated things without the simpler things. There are also some things that AI shouldn't be doing, so there are many things AI cannot do, but probably will. There's some things that AI will never do, like, for example, have a body. You could put it in a robot, but that's not quite the same thing. So AI literally has no skin in the game, which means it shouldn't be making decisions about our bodies, right? It can't have empathy. It can emulate empathy, but it can't have it because it doesn't have the things that we have to have empathy with. It has its own version of empathy, which might be superior in some sense, but it's not ours. So I don't want robots making ethical decisions for me. It also doesn't have lived experience, right? Because it doesn't live. It has, even if it were conscious, it would have its own kind of consciousness. And I wouldn't expect it to do the right thing by me any more than I would expect me to do the right thing for my dog all the time. I try, but it doesn't always work. So, then there's John Searle and intentionality. This is back in the 1980s, and he argued essentially that you can build a machine that processes symbols, and it can do it perfectly, but it doesn't understand what the symbols mean because it doesn't recognize that these symbols have a correspondence in the real world. It's just a symbolic system, solely a symbolic system, I should say. The very first thing humans learn, I think, is the difference between us and the rest of the world. That was Piaget's argument anyway. And so that's incredibly important because that's the foundation of everything, including our ethics, right? That when we act, it has repercussions outside ourselves. It seems so obvious, but you're not born knowing that. And I actually think that there are people who have differences in the way that works, and we see those showing up as pretty profound differences in the way they behave. Anyway, so the point being, a machine can never, in principle, have that. So it can spoof all sorts of behaviors, and it can do it in the way a human might at the surface, but it doesn't I mean, you're never going to eat Hal, right? Close the pod bay doors, Hal. Hal doesn't understand. I actually used to give a final exam question in science fiction and psych. Did Hal commit murder? And the A plus answer is no, because Hal doesn't understand living and dying. Right? And then the A plus plus answer is Hal does understand living and dying as he sings daisies at the end of the movie. Spoiler alert, by the way.
If they haven't seen it by now, I think it's fair.
I agree, but nevertheless.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different directions as thinking of these as thought experiments that are really intriguing to me, but just bear into a little bit of it. This idea that, of course, ethics is socially constructed. It's something we're not just innately born with. We're developing an understanding of that, in part maybe because of how you maybe assume the sense that we understand the other and we're separate from the rest of our environment. And as humans, we're distinct, perhaps. And maybe there is a little bit there that's kind of hardwired, but even then, how we apply it, what we do with it, is something that's very socially constructed. As we think about the incorporation of artificial intelligence into a lot of the workflows or whatever's happening, part of the answer is, and I think there are two ways I'm going with this in my mind, and happy to hear your thoughts on either one. One of them, thinking of it as, we call it cheating, but sometimes cheating is a feature and not a bug, because if you think of, we want somebody to think really creatively. If they're only going to live within the constraints of a socially constructed set of rules, they're not going to be that creative. We want somebody that can say, no, there's another way to envision this. And so we might interpret that as cheating, and some people might view that and interpret that as being a visionary. There are different examples where we can kind of play around with that. The other part of it is to think, maybe what we call cheating today, and so maybe our colleagues will call cheating using AI, won't be called cheating tomorrow. And do you see that developing or changing? And if you were to, write this book or write another version of the book in 2030, do you think your understanding of academic integrity, or what might be a common understanding of academic integrity, might have changed by then?
Yes and no. So the no part is the values, respecting other people, being able to be trustworthy, being responsible, doing what you say you're going to do. Those things have not changed, and they shouldn't change, and they're not going to change. Jonathan Haidt, the very controversial social psychologist, has argued that there are a few moral modules, essentially, and that they get programmed somewhat differently based on your cultural context. And people with different, political or social contexts, prioritize them differently and operationalize them differently. I don't want to get into that argument, but the gist of that is that there are basic things and then there are situational things, and that I think we all agree on. So yeah, the fundamentals won't change. And cheating is ultimately a term we use when there are rules that can be broken and when there is fairness that can be violated. And so being innovative is always going to be okay in those contexts where everybody has an equal chance to be successful. Right? If anyone could have done that innovation, but you're the only one who figured it out, then good for you. But if we specifically said to everyone, don't do that, and you do that, that's misconduct, right? We set a rule. Now, if they don't understand where those rules come from, or if we've been bad in setting those rules, we hold some responsibility, right? Just because when someone cheats, there's always more than one reason. And some of those reasons have to do with the rules that we set. This is not to say that students are not to blame when they cheat. They absolutely are. But we can build situations that are less conducive or more conducive. Kath Ellis, who's a leader and a major thinker in our field, said you can't design cheating out of a course, but you can absolutely design it in. And I think that's right.
That's good.
And so our job is not to force students to be ethical, but it's to create decision structures that favor doing things the way that we think is best for them. And so, the old saw, right? You're only cheating yourself. Mm-hmm. That's never been true, but that's our goal.
Yeah.
Our goal is to make it so that is the case, that any student who does it the way we want gets the thing that they're trying to get, and the students who do it other ways don't get it. and that one doesn't have any effect on the other. But unfortunately, our system doesn't work that way. It's a zero-sum game, right? There's only so many spots in medical school. There's only so many Supreme Court clerkships, right? So you have to differentiate between people, and therefore you can't just say your learning is divorced from someone else's. But yeah, I absolutely think that the ultimate goal ethically is to build systems where students' best interests are aligned with the things that we think are in their best interests.
You've been so generous with your time. We really appreciate having this chance to talk with you about this, and I can't wait until your keynote address in July. For anybody that's watching that maybe isn't as familiar with your work, where can they find out more about you? Where can they read more of your work or get in touch?
First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for having me back to Fredericksburg. I'm really excited to be back. You know, they say you can't go home again, so we'll see. But in the meantime, you can check out all of Trisha's and my work on this topic at theoppositeofcheating.com, including our own podcast, where we try to talk to the folks who we cited in the book, and we try to shine a light on the amazing work that made it possible for us to do the opposite of cheating, because none of it is original thinking. All we're doing is making connections between things that I think other folks maybe haven't had a chance to make.
Well, excellent. I definitely encourage it and check out the podcast. I mean, I've listened to a few episodes. They're really great. And it's good to dig in on some of those issues. And David, thanks again. Really appreciate you being here and look forward to seeing you back on campus soon.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Stefan.
Nice to meet you too, David. Thanks.